Australia is a land of new beginnings, and men should be able to live alone the sins of the past.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. For much of our history, Australians have liked to think of themselves as a people willing to give others a second chance. A nation born from a convict colony, shaped by emancipists, determined to turn over a new leaf and make something of themselves. But is this really the whole story? What if Australia has always been equally susceptible to media sensationalism, public outrage and character assassination? What if some of the pathologies we associate with modern day politics, trial by media, cancel culture, political martyrdom and the manipulation of public opinion, were present at the moment the nation itself was being formed? Well, my guest today is an award-winning biographer whose latest book, The Stained Man, A Crime, a Scandal and the Making of a Nation, explores those questions through the extraordinary life of Richard Dennis Meagher. A gifted lawyer, political operator and Federation-era parliamentarian, Meagher was at the centre of one of colonial Australia's greatest scandals, the notorious Dean poisoning case. His rise, spectacular fall and improbable political resurrection reveals much about the character of Australia at the turn of the 20th century, when ambition, prejudice, violence and a yearning for status shaped the politics of what contemporaries called the bear pit. Patrick Mullins, once again, for your second appearance, welcome to Afternoon Light to discuss this fascinating character or characters of our early politics.
Thanks for having me, Georgina. Great to be here.
So I don't think many people these days would be familiar with Richard Dick. I think he was more commonly known by Meagher. Tell me what made you want to write a book about this relatively obscure colonial era, Federation era figure?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I was reading a book called A History of Solicitors in New South Wales.
As you do.
As you do. Absolute page turner, sterling work of scholarship. But I came across in it just these two very pungent paragraphs on Meagher. The first one spelled out the Dean case, this sensational scandal, as you say, that happened in 1895. And it said that, Meagher went through this scandal and he was disgraced by the end of it. The second paragraph went on to describe how he resurrected himself, how he tried to expunge this stain on his reputation. And there was an ambivalence in that paragraph, as though the writer couldn't really work out whether Meagher was genuinely sorry for what he had done or whether he was trying quite cynically to rewrite and distort this scandal. And I thought that's something really interesting. The idea that somebody could try to rewrite their scandal and their past, or maybe they could try to atone and make up for it. And so I thought that's something to look at. So I began looking at it and writing, and very quickly came to the view that Meagher was not, in fact, trying to atone, that he was doing all this quite cynically. But in the background to this, I was noticing parallels with contemporary events. So there have been certain legal trials and defamation actions in the recent years where I think you can see parallels and resonances in Meagher's story. His attempts to rebuild himself, to climb on the back of political exigency, to use status and prestige, to redeem his reputation. And I thought this is something that seems peculiarly Australian and seems to have echoes of other cases and other individuals. And some of them are weaved in the book and spoken about very obliquely. But it seemed to me that Meagher's story was a way not only of exploring a scandal and his own individual life, but in fact something more representative too. Something about the country and something too about these stained men that we have in our public life.
Yeah. So, you're being very polite, but I'm thinking really looking at the lessons to be learned from a Bruce Lehrmann, a criminal trial and then a civil trial. And of course, we're now looking at the criminal trial of Ben Roberts-Smith, but there was a civil action against the 9 newspapers for defamation. So, yeah, these figures who are on the margins of politics that are sort of raised up, brought down, raised up, and they become quite political figures, even though what they're accused of isn't necessarily political at all. And this is, you argue, potentially an Australian phenomenon from way back. Now, before we launch into the full discussion, and I'm really looking forward to that, can you just tell us about the Dean case and what brought Richard Meagher to notoriety? Because I think that's fundamental to this story.
It is. I mean, so this is a really sensational scandal. It begins in March 1895 with a Sydney ferryman named George Dean, who was arrested by police and charged with attempting to murder his own wife, Mary, using arsenic and strychnine, 2 poisons, just to make sure that he got the job done.
Which he didn't.
He didn't. Now, when the police arrested him and this news emerged, the general reaction was confusion and disbelief. Part of that was because Dean was kind of known to a wide number of people in Sydney. He was a ferryman. He was also a young man and seemingly quite sober and sound in his judgment. This is why he was captaining a ferry. Atop that, his wife, Mary, was thought, in the words of one writer, to be not uncomely. They were only 1 year married, and they'd in fact only just had a baby 2 months ago. So the thought that somehow this charming, good-looking, mature, sound man who was known to be a hero, I mean, who'd been publicly acclaimed for saving women who'd fallen into Sydney Harbour, the idea that he would suddenly turn around and try to murder his wife using poison just seemed bizarre. It just seemed improbable, impossible to believe. And so the case came before the courts in March 1895, and Dean's solicitor, Richard Meagher, the subject of my book, decided to play on that confusion and disbelief. He suggested during the trial that far from being a guilty man, Dean was in fact an innocent victim himself, that he was being stitched up by his wife and mother-in-law. And to kind of give that claim a bit of credibility, Meagher seized upon evidence suggesting that Mary and her mother were connected with criminality and prostitution. So Mary Dean had grown up in Surrey Hills, conveniently, according to Meagher, right across the road from an assignation house. And her mother had done stints in prison, changed her name a few times, and been convicted of theft and transported to Australia from the UK. So there was this background of criminality there. In the courtroom, though, the jury basically said, doesn't wash, it doesn't make sense. There are only George and Mary in the house. Mary is ingesting this food and drink that is shown to contain arsenic and strychnine. There's no one else around. The idea that she would try to do it herself to stitch her husband up, bizarre. And so they voted to convict. And at the time, the conviction would be the end of the story. There was no way to appeal the verdict, and it came with a mandatory sentence of death. So Dean was going to hang. Shortly after the trial, like within 2 or 3 days, that public confusion and disbelief just intensified. It was catalysed by that verdict, by that conviction, by Dean's likely death. And people just could not possibly get their heads around the idea that Dean was guilty. And so very quickly there sprung up this campaign to have the verdict revisited. They wanted the government to call a royal commission to probe into it and find out what had gone on and arrive at supposedly the true facts of the case. I mean, the newspapers at this time were really profound in egging it on. They talked about it as a decided injustice. They said that the jury had been browbeaten by the judge to return a guilty verdict. You know, the Bulletin magazine famously said that there was an utter want of direct proof of any kind. And to come to that conclusion, you had to set aside all of the physical evidence. Nonetheless, so amid this, Meagher went to Darlinghurst Jail to interview George Dean and speak with him. And he was going at the direction of his law firm partner, a guy named Paddy Crick. Now, Crick's a pretty infamous, notoriously corrupt politician, but a very formidable police court solicitor. And Crick had said to him, basically, look, there's this agitation going on. We can try and reopen this through political means, but we should work out, first of all, whether Dean is actually guilty. So go there, see him. If he's guilty, then, we should let this rest because maybe he'll get some mercy, maybe he'll get off. But if he's guilty and he pretends to be innocent and the government finds irrefutable proof that he is actually guilty, then they'll come down on him like a ton of bricks. So find out for sure. And Meagher went in there to Darlinghurst Jail, to Dean, and effectively tricked him. He just said, oh, the game's up. Police know you're guilty. Spill the beans, tell me everything. And Dean told him. Dean confessed. Dean said he was guilty. And Meagher went away from Darlinghurst Jail and decided nonetheless that he was going to conceal Dean's guilt. And in fact, that he was going to continue this campaign. And so over the next few weeks, this campaign grew and grew and grew. You had public meetings up and down the length of New South Wales. You had blanket press coverage in the newspapers. You had people writing in saying, the voice of the people is the voice of God, and the voice of the people right now says Dean is innocent. Therefore, get rid of this.
I mean, this was a case that had a jury, though.
It was,
So you're judged by 12 of your peers, and they had unanimously, found Dean guilty. But despite all that, the media attention and scrutiny and the public opinion was massively on the side of Dean being innocent. So they think
the jury was dismissed as jelly-brained idiots.
Jelly-brained idiots, right.
I mean, one thing that feeds into this is that the judge at the trial, William Windeyer, had intervened to bring about a guilty verdict. It has to be said. It's a bit complicated to talk about, but the jury effectively thought that they were going to get out from the jury room at midnight on the Saturday night, and that if they didn't come to a verdict by then, they'd get discharged. The judge said, no, that's wrong. You're going to be there till Sunday night or even Monday morning if you don't come to a verdict. But he also knew that within the jury, there were some who said, look, he's guilty of sin. We just don't want him to die. And so that's why they were kind of holding up on whether or not to give a verdict. And then the judge found out that the foreman's son had died during the jury deliberations. And so his thought in his head was, they have a mistaken comprehension about the timing. They have this little problem with the conviction and the sentence. I need to bring this about end fast. So I'll intervene and tell them and effectively make a deal with them, return a guilty verdict, and I'll make a recommendation to mercy, and, maybe Dean will live. But of course, the press and the public didn't know anything about that. They just saw the judge telling the jury, the facts are clear, come to a verdict already. That's that. It went into this enormous campaign, and this is only over 2 or 3 weeks as well. It's worth saying it's enormously heated, enormously fast, and it culminates in this meeting of about 12,000 people in Sydney Town Hall.
Wow. And the population of Sydney wouldn't have been that big at the time. So this is quite a large body of people.
It's a lot of people. I mean, I think it's about 5,000 inside the actual hall and then about 7,000 outside the hall. It's astonishing. And there's people on the platform as well, like Billy Hughes, Chris Watson, on the platform in the hall kind of going, yep, we need to revisit this verdict.
And you mentioned those two names, both Labor politicians. Was this becoming a political issue? Like, was it a Labor versus the sort of non-Labor forces? Is that what the establishment?
It was definitely becoming bigger and definitely reaching into the political sphere. Crick, Mar's partner, he was a parliamentarian, and he'd raised it as a matter of debate in the Assembly. And there's, I think, and argue in the book that there was a clear parliamentary threat to the government, that if they didn't act on the public will in this case, then something would happen, that there might be a vote to pull power out of the government and appoint a royal commission. And this is why, in the end, the government of George Reid decided the next day after this meeting to appoint a royal commission. So they appointed a royal commission to inquire into the verdict. It began sitting 2 or 3 weeks later. Ma appeared again for Dean. The Crown retained Sir Julian Salomons.
And by this stage, Ma, of course, knows that Dean is guilty. And
knows that he's guilty, has concealed it, is telling everyone around that Dean is innocent. But at this royal commission just smears Mary Dean and her mother in the most awful terms. I mean, yes, Mary Dean's mum had a criminal past, but in this instance, this was awful stuff. They were told they were prostitutes. Ma and his colleagues dredged up all sorts of cranks and pimps and frauds from Sydney's underworld who came and told enormous lies and distortions and smears about them. And effectively trying to put against Dean and the kind of saintly halo that was being attached to him, to put against him 2 women who were degenerate and degraded. I mean, one of the barristers at the Royal Commission, in fact, said that Mary Dean and her mother were degraded and degenerate beasts simply because they'd brought these charges. I mean, Mary Dean is literally half dead. She can't walk, can't look after her baby daughter. She's so ill from all this poison that she's had to imbibe. And yet she's being portrayed as the guilty person, as the one who's stitching up her poor husband. But it works. This is the thing, it works. The Royal Commission decided that Mary Dean and her mother, their reputation was so bad that nothing could be attached to their evidence. No credibility could be attached to it. So they set it aside and said, well, in this instance, it might still be open to the possibility that Dean's innocent. So we will overturn the verdict. Dean will get a pardon. He'll be set free. So Dean was set free. And Ma, of course, was immediately acclaimed a hero because he's saved this man from the noose and saved him from this unjust verdict. Of course, we know Dean's guilty. Maher's just managed to get a guilty man off. The government of the day, at the same time, went to an election, and Maher, who's brilliantly ambitious and wants to get into politics, decided to seize on this goodwill and the wave of favour and stood for a Sydney seat. And of course, he got elected. So he's in Parliament on the basis of this awful fraud. But 6 weeks later, he's out on his ear because it comes out that Dean is guilty.
Yeah.
And it's all been a lie.
But it comes out that he's guilty and that it's all been a lie because of Maher. I mean, Maher has confided in a judge, hasn't he? in Julian Salomons. So he's actually part of his own demise as well. He could have just kept quiet about the whole confession thing.
Not for the first time, not for the last time. A man's willingness to launch a libel suit rebounds on him spectacularly.
Yeah.
During the election campaign, the Daily Telegraph had said that Maher really shouldn't be a successful candidate, that he should lose because he was obviously a rubbish lawyer, because he should have gotten Dean off at trial. You know, everyone knows Dean's innocent. He should have got him off at trial. Maher decided to sue the Daily Telegraph, and for advice on that, he went to Sir Julian Salomons, so former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who had appeared for the Crown at the Royal Commission. And he said to him, look, I want to sue them. Here's the article. And Salomons kind of said to him, on what basis would you sue them? You know, if Dean's innocent, yes, you should have got him off at trial. And Maher said, well, he's not innocent. He's obviously guilty. And you know, in doing that and in going to Salomons in this way, it's worth saying Maher had technically given himself a bond of client solicitor confidentiality.
Yeah.
So he felt secure enough to say this to Salomons. But Salomons, who was a much more admirable and upstanding figure than Maher in many ways, decided that he could not be allowed to become involuntarily party to this conspiracy to defeat the ends of justice. And so he wrestled with it over a couple of weeks. He tried to persuade Maher to confess. He tried to persuade and have Dean leave Australia making a confession. Because, I mean, Mary Dean and her mother were still suffering at this point. Crowds were following them in the streets and shouting at them and abusing them. Mary was still being hospitalised. They were impoverished. I mean, literally working as cleaners at this point. Awful happening to them. So Salomons was tortured about it. But it began to leak out as Salomons kind of consulted here and there with people. It began to leak out and circulate. And at first, Maher reacted to this by kind of claiming it was a joke and saying, oh, Salomons, he's a bit loopy, he's a bit insane. He's just kind of imagining all this. I just said it as a joke, ha, 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 ha. But then it stopped because it went into Parliament. A parliamentarian raised as a question, asked the Attorney-General, is there any truth to these rumours that George Dean is guilty? And the Attorney-General said, I can't say. I'm bound by confidentiality of my own. I can't say anything. And so at that point then, the kind of furor erupted again.
Yeah.
You know, oh my God, what happened?
What was the public reaction to these revelations? Because they've been massively on the side of Dean, the lovely, brave, and I think he was quite handsome too, wasn't he, ferryman, who's been tricked or at least framed by his wife and mother-in-law. And now it's being revealed, no, he was guilty after all. I mean, did the public swing back to hating on Dean, or was Dean exonerated still in their eyes?
It took a little while for Dean, for the label of guilty to get really firmly attached to him, but it only really came out about when Maher came clean. So, I mean, there were these extraordinary parliamentary exchanges. Salomons gave a statement to the Attorney-General, who read it out in Legislative Council. Maher's partner, Paddy Crick, responded drunkenly, saying that Salomons was a lunatic, that he was insane. I mean, abused him as well. It's worth saying, abused him for his Jewish background, called him a lying Hebrew, the shillings, pounds and pence Jew, you know, all sorts of, I mean, vile slurs being directed towards Salomons. Maher amplified that, again, seized on Salomons in the past had a mental breakdown. It's one of the reasons why he had resigned as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Maher seized on that and kind of said, oh, you know, yes, he's going insane. And Salomons responded with this amazing 4-hour speech that did so much to bring people on side, where he recounted all the meetings, recounted his attempts to persuade Maher, recounted how he'd wrestled with this problem of what to do, been kind of consumed by it, and defended himself too, defended his Jewish background, pushed back on all of the slurs being mounted. And that really won over a significant portion of people. But then, of course, the conspiracy just came unstuck. The chemist who had supplied Dean with the poison, who had obfuscated about this, came forward and confessed to the police that he'd done it. Dean was, completely secure, thought, no, I'm all fine. And then police said, actually, we're going to test now the soot in your chimneys, where we understand you burned the poisons after you'd finished with them and you knew we were coming. And at that point, Dean kind of collapsed. And the next day confessed in this very sweaty interview in Darlinghurst Jail.
But he's been tried and then pardoned, so he's still free, presumably. They can't try him. Double jeopardy rule.
They couldn't.
Yeah.
They couldn't. But this is where, the hubris of Dean, the hubris of Ma kind of comes up. When the first rumours circulated, Dean wrote to Parliament petitioning them to kind of clear the air. And that's what spurred Julian Salomons to come forward. And when Julian Salomons made this first statement, Dean then made a statutory declaration that he provided to the Parliament that he was innocent.
Right.
And so now he had perjured himself.
Okay, so he could go to jail for that.
Yeah, and he did for 8 years.
8 years, right. But what was the impact, though, Patrick, on the government? Because, the government's fallen for this. George Reid has called the Royal Commission after the 12,000 people gathered at Sydney Town Hall. He's capitulated to the public pressure to, really bring into question the independence of the judiciary, respect for the rule of law, that were being grossly undermined by the Parliament then overriding what a judge and jury had determined. So was there a large political fallout for the Reid government on this?
Look, not really. One reason for that is that the Reid government went to an election straight after the Royal Commission had fallen, and it was re-elected. So it was kind of able to say, look, we've got a parliamentary majority, we've allayed this. And of course the resignations, and the emergence, the fact that Dean was guilty, almost kind of vindicated the government. The government was able to say, look, we were actually right in our reluctance to call a Royal Commission. And these are some examples of terrible people in Ma and Crick and Dean and so on. So they were able to kind of duck any opprobrium for it. But you then had, even after Ma resigned from the Parliament, you had these conspiracy trials, which lasted until the following year, and in which all sorts of dirt was kind of brought out, how these charges had been manufactured and how they'd gotten off. But ultimately they ended with Dean going to jail for 8 years for perjury and Ma only getting flicked off the roll of solicitors. He and Dean were initially convicted of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, but Ma then employed a brilliant barrister named Edmund Barton to appeal against that. And Barton
well chosen, yes.
Well chosen, very well chosen. So, literally he leads this enormous scandal, gets to Parliament, is forced to resign, but his only lasting punishment, really, beyond a social disgrace, is that he is flicked off the roll of solicitors. That's it.
But that is the thing that he sort of pursues for the rest of his life, readmission to the role. It's amazing how single-minded he is about this.
It's something that he made central to his identity. It was incredibly important to him to be a solicitor. He always talked about how much he'd suffered to enter the profession. And in this sense, he'd been a poor Irish Catholic kid growing up in Bathurst. His father was a police officer. His mother had died when he was young. He'd come to Sydney, studied, wanted to be an actor, overcame a stammer, managed to enter this profession, at which he was extremely good. He was a very good solicitor, and he was earning a lot of money for it. So to him, being thrown out of the legal profession was an enormous injury, something profound to his identity, as well as his material prospects. And so he decided he wanted to overcome that, and he wanted to distort what had happened in the Dean case. He wanted to rewrite what had happened to minimise his own culpability and to maximise any idea that he was a victim, which he did. He legitimately thought himself to be the victim in this whole thing, not Mary Dean, not her mother. He was the victim. And a torturous reasoning, but, quite profoundly held for him. But as you say, this was the spur for the next 25 years of his career and his life. He spent the next 25 years making repeated applications to the courts for readmission to the role of solicitors, and kept getting knocked back, except on one occasion where they did put him back on the roll, at which point, however, the High Court intervened and threw him back off.
I mean, this is amazing, the lengths he was going to be readmitted, but also that it was taken that seriously, that it was getting up to the High Court. They agreed to hear the case. That this is just, I mean, what does it say about colonial New South Wales, but I guess early Federation Australia, that someone like Meagher could, I mean, he was a politician through this time. He was in the New South Wales Parliament. I think he was he Lord Mayor of Sydney as well?
Yeah,
I mean,
he became...
he's doing quite well politically, and yet all the while he is really single-minded in his pursuit of being readmitted onto the bar roll.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it goes to the fact that it's just so fundamental to his identity and who he was. And it's worth saying, the legal profession at this time it's kind of the ticket to the top, really. The number of Federation era politicians who were barristers or solicitors is enormous. And I think Meagher kind of counted himself in that. But when we talk about, for example, the High Court's intervention in 1909 to flick Meagher back off the rolls after a hearing, that was the first time that the High Court had intervened into a matter of who was going to be allowed to be a legal practitioner in a state. And Meagher and his supporters called it, an assault on states' rights. So they talked about it in that vein. And of course, it's coming at a time when all these institutions like the High Court, like the Federal Parliament, they're all kind of protean. Yes. They're still shifting and establishing themselves. And so Meagher's actions in this vein become quite influential. You mentioned his political career, though. This is the other part of it that's astonishing, is that notwithstanding his disgrace after the Dean case, Meagher managed to get back into Parliament. In 1898, he stood for the seat of the Tweed in the northern part of New South Wales. And I find it amazing, I think it's quite amazing, that he was able to stake his candidacy so much on the idea that he was a victim.
Yeah.
So he went up there and he said,
people accepted that.
Absolutely.
But do you think it was because of a sense of, was it the anti-Semitism towards Julian Salomons, or was it a sort of left versus right campaign?
No, it was very much a thing of, you are in this electorate in the top of New South Wales, you are ignored, you are overlooked, no one in Sydney cares about you, you are victims of a neglectful government. And I'm a victim too, and I know what it's like. But I'm willing to fight for you, and I'm willing to bear the scars and all the slings and arrows. And you can see my scars. You can see these things. I've been scarred. But you vote for me, and I'll fight for you. So he was kind of making his victimhood effectively synonymous with theirs and drawing upon that. And it's something he did over and over again throughout his career. He would kind of portray himself as this martyr. And one of the newspapers, I think it was the Telegraph, said of Meagher that he was so practiced at wearing a martyr's halo while professing enormous humility for people. And it's something he did over and over again. It was a way of arousing popular sympathy for him and a way of giving people a stake in his career, because he made himself into an identity. He was always there for the newspapers, always ready to add colour and verve and movement to things. I mean, this is the point I could probably talk about. When he got into Parliament, a journalist and editor named John Norton said that he was the champion criminal of the continent and the premier purder of our public life. Loved his alliteration, John Norton.
And he called him Mendax Meagher.
That's right, Mendax Meagher.
Mendacious,
Mendax Meagher. Meagher responded to that by going out and buying a whip. And in the middle of Pitt Street, in the middle of the day, seeing Norton coming toward him, whipping him around the head with this whip. Norton pulled out a gun, tried to shoot him. Meagher scampered, as you probably would, quite sensibly.
Yeah, whip versus pistol, you're definitely running away from the pistol, yes.
It's not a fair fight, really. But, they went to court, and Meagher he played to the public. He got up there and he said, oh, Norton, look at this scrofulous creature. You can't grow eyebrows, you diseased thing. So he was aware of public spectacle, he was aware of colour, and he could portray it and draw people into him with it. So it became a really notable part of his political career. And, of course, it undergirded all these attempts to go back to the courts for readmission to the role of solicitors.
Yeah. So his political career, though, notwithstanding his obsession to be readmitted as a solicitor, but, I mean, he was initially on the Progressive Party, right, and then moved to the Labor Party. But his politics was quite left-wing, quite radical. Is that how you characterise it?
I don't think I'd say radical. He was on the margins of the Protectionist Party, who after Federation became the Progressives. And in 1909, Meagher then went across to Labor. his actual inclinations and outlook, he's a bit woolly on some of it. He was certainly a protectionist. He loved protectionism. But when he got into Parliament in 1898, he in fact supported George Reed's free trade government to stay in power, to bring about federation. So he was on the margins already.
Which is interesting because Labor MPs had been opposed to federation. So he said, he was not a Labor MP at the time, but he's not on the side of the party he would eventually join.
Yeah, but it's worth saying as well that Labor at that point was actually supporting George Reed in office in New South Wales. So they were kind of happy to have, Labor obviously, they supported federation in principle. They didn't support the final version that was being enacted in 1898 to 9. So it is a bit odd, but Meagher always made a big thing about how he was an independent person and how he couldn't be bought and couldn't be sold and so on. He could, actually. He was enmeshed in so many corruption scandals even after this. But it became important to him to support federation and to help bring it about because it also helped rehabilitate his name. So he stumped up in the northern New South Wales following William Holman, a Labor politician and very noted orator, following him around and trying to bring back anyone who was going to vote no, bring them back to the fold. Came down to Sydney, stumped again in favour of federation, and Sydney was where federation opposition was most concentrated in New South Wales. So doing that and helping bring it about, it rehabilitated Meagher's name a bit. And this is something we see over and over again Meagher would do. He'd kind of play on political exigency, gain some allies here and there, and stake his name in certain causes. So this is why, he was able to get Edmund Barton, obviously, as his advocate. George Reed came to be his barrister on quite a few occasions. He had people from across the political divides signing petitions saying that he should go back on the role of solicitor.
And this was because of his advocacy for federation, you think?
For federation, for different measures in Parliament as well. He managed to pass this a little bill reforming courtroom procedure and thereafter would trumpet it and say, look, I did this. I'm an independent member, but I've managed to bring this about. Isn't this great? This is proof of how good I am. Another point, he was appointed to a royal commission into the tick-borne claimant, which is another really fantastic scandal of this period. The appointment letter carried a thing from the New South Wales Chief Justice saying, "To Richard Dennis Meagher, know ye that we have all trust and confidence in your honour and integrity." And Meagher would say, "Look, I'm so trusted by the Chief Justice, but I'm not allowed to practice the law." So he'd use these things, these tokens of esteem and prestige, to kind of rehabilitate himself and sell his version of the Dean case and sell himself as this champion and so on. But obviously, in 1909, he went to the Labor Party. He joined Labor. I think that was driven in large part by a desire to survive politically, because Labor had at that point decided that it was going to contest every seat at an election. I think Meagher thought, I'm probably going to get done unless I join them. But Labor gave him a ladder to climb, and he managed to climb up through its ranks. By 1912, having helped Labor get into power in New South Wales, he was a candidate for ministerial office, which prompted the governor of the day, Baron Chelmsford, to intervene and say to James McGowan and William Holman, this man's past is of the worst kind, cannot be a minister, you have to prevent this. Nonetheless, Meagher managed to gazump Holman and McGowan in 1913 to become elected the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. In 1915, he managed to get himself appointed Lord Mayor of Sydney. And it's worth saying, at this point, looking back, those seem like very minor, piddling kind of offices.
No, I don't think so. That's massive.
Oh, okay.
I don't live in Sydney. I know the name of the Lord Mayor of Sydney. I don't know the name of the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, I have to admit. But maybe if you reminded me who it was, I'd go, oh, yes, I know.
I don't even know myself.
But the Lord Mayor of Sydney is a big deal. It's Australia's largest city. It was certainly the largest city back then. It was an important very, very important part of Australia's economy.
But they loomed larger back then too, because at that point, federal politics, at least in New South Wales, federal politics, it's down in Melbourne, and it's this newfangled thing, and it doesn't quite have the same ambit that it has today. So the speakership and Lord Mayor, they're much more important back in the day. They're much more conspicuous public offices, and for Meagher to get them is just astonishing. It is crazy, in fact, that he managed to do so.
Is it because of his, is he particularly conniving or ruthless? Is it his oratory? He's a good speaker. There's some amazing quotes. of his. He had very sort of emotive, florid language. And it was at a time, of course, where oratory was just so highly valued for politicians, for political communicators.
I think that is the big part of it. His oratory, this is a time when people don't have phones, they don't have televisions, they don't have radios. So when they want to get entertained, they go to Parliament, they go to the courts, they go to the public meetings outside the pubs.
The town hall.
The town hall, that's right. And people like Meagher could rouse his listeners very well. And when you put that with the fact that he was this kind of identity, a Sydney identity, he's always in the media, he's always out about, it became very easy for people to like him and to follow him. And I think that became his most notable part in Labor. I think also his moral puritanism, notwithstanding his actions in the Dean case, Meagher always regarded himself as a moral exemplar, and so would always talk about principles and sound very high-minded and idealistic and grandiloquent in how he talked about them. And people were attracted to that. They liked it. And so I think that's one of the reasons why he was able to climb up within Labor. Not being affiliated to any of the unions, not having that kind of background as well, it made him independent to them. And so it's even more astonishing. I mean, when he became president of the Labor Party in New South Wales, in, again, I think 1915, he was the first person to have done that without a background in the trade unions ever. And I think the next person who did that was Paul Keating. So it kind of speaks to his singular achievement here.
And his critics at the time, in the 1910s, were they drawing attention to his problematic past, his, misleading the court, the Royal Commission, basically a liar?
Yeah. They were trying. I mean, so many of the people who were involved in the Dean case continued to figure in public life. The prosecutor at the Dean case, or the junior to the prosecutor rather, he became the Premier. This is Charles Gregory Wade. And he constantly was talking about how appalling it was that this man was still managing to endure in public life. But it was to no effect. Mary Dean, a few years after the Dean case, wrote a letter to the newspapers pointing out that, because the courts had ordered Meagher at one point, apologise. You've got to apologise. And Meagher said, okay, I apologise to the judge, I apologise to Julian Salomons, I apologise to the Attorney General. And the court's like, great, thanks for that. Mary Dean wrote a letter to the newspaper saying, what about me? He's done the most appalling things to me. But the court has said nothing about it whatsoever. They don't care about me. This is appalling. But no restitution made to her, no compensation, no token of apology or regret.
And she never sued him for slander?
No, I don't know if she could have, but she certainly never did. I think she wanted to move on with her life in some ways. But so the effect of this is that by 1916, Meagher, as he said, he was a demigod in the Labor movement in New South Wales. And he kind of, in some ways, was. He's enormously high appointments. But, of course, the First World War brings him undone. He was extraordinarily aggressive in drumming up recruits and saying how Australia should fight it. He talked about having to pour lead into the German beast in order to defeat it. And when the conscription debates came about in 1916, he was firmly in favour of it. And that obviously split the Labor Party. He chose to stay with Billy Hughes and the pro-conscription elements. And so very swiftly in 1917, he lost his seat in the Parliament, but he managed to gain another term as Lord Mayor, but at the same time gained as well the enmity of Labor thereafter.
Yeah, for fighting for conscription. He says he's driven out of Parliament by a saturnalia of sectarianism and a veritable hurricane of hate. Very powerful language. I don't actually know what a saturnalia is. Something the size of Saturn? Is that what it's implying?
I think it's a wild storm. And I mean, sectarianism features very heavily in this. And he's Irish Catholic, and obviously the Easter Uprising had happened in the background during the First World War. And in his electorate, there was so much talk about, movements within the Catholic Church and efforts among certain opponents to distort things and play them around. So he was seizing on all these different things for leverage to try and keep a hold of it. But he couldn't do so.
Why was he so in favour of conscription? I mean, for someone who's an ultimate political survivor who had risen to the heights of the Labor Party as president, had been Speaker, been Lord Mayor, to then split on this issue and end his political career, it doesn't strike me that he was putting his survivability first. He was obviously very driven by this issue, very, very committed to the side of conscription.
Yeah, I think he saw it as synonymous with victory in the war and then for the well-being of the British Empire. I mean, there's a plaque up on the wall in the Legislative Assembly commemorating 2 MLAs who died during the First World War. But Meagher unveiled this plaque, and at the time he said, for every enemy bullet in every Australian body is but another rivet between old country and the new. So for the First World War, doing everything you possibly could, that to him was so much more important than his political survivability. But I think too, he was aware that even as he aroused the enmity of the Labor Party, he was also gaining allies elsewhere. And I mean, he shows that almost immediately. He had been appointed Lord Mayor of Sydney for a 1-year term, and the understanding was that he would be yielding the office at the end of the year to a non-Labor appointee. Now, to get to the ballot, Meagher's been expelled from Labor. He goes to the non-Labor guys, vote for me for another year. And literally the voting swapped completely. All the Labor guys who'd voted for him 12 months before voted against him. All the non-Labor guys who had voted against him 12 months before voted for him. And so he secured another term.
Right.
Moreover, even though he lost his seat in the Legislative Assembly, he was soon put back into the Legislative Council and he was granted the title of Honourable. So, he's now lost his seat, but he's the Honourable Richard Meagher, Lord Mayor of Sydney still.
And this is the Nationalists who put him into the Legislative Council, of course, the opposition to Labor. So he does finally get back on the bar roll, doesn't he?
He
Incredibly.
Does. In 1920, after 9 applications to the courts, after 25 years of fighting, Meagher prevailed upon the New South Wales Parliament to pass this one-line bill overriding the courts and restoring him to the role of solicitors. Legislation that had never been done anywhere before in the British Dominions, never done before in Australia, and to my knowledge, never repeated since. But they're overridden. He's put back on the rolls. And I mean, Joseph Carruthers, who had been a minister during the Dean case, who had this long memory of it, pointed out and said at the time, look, mercy, forgiveness, these all have their place. I think Meagher's record during the war should enable us to wash away all sins, but we put him back on the roll. And at that point, Meagher effectively disappeared from political life.
He got what he had desired for so long.
He got what he had desired. But, I mean, he'd so fully distorted and rewritten the Dean case that by the time he died, the Archbishop of Sydney said that there was no moral fault with Meagher and that he could have engraved on his tombstone, his was the troubled life, the conflict and the pain, the grief, the bitterness of strife, the honour without stain.
Wow.
So,
I wonder what Mary Dean thought of that.
That's a very good question, given that she was still alive and lived until 1969. So it's a very good question what Mary Dean thought of it. Yeah.
Patrick, looking back, obviously, on your book and the research you did on Meagher, is this the story of the great Australian redemption, that we are the land of the second chance? Or is this a story that's about the tawdriness of Australian politics and those in the margins of politics, and what is good becomes bad and what is bad becomes good, and the mob can decide?
It's a really good question, because I think it's both in so many ways. I mean, the constant talk throughout those 25 years when Meagher is trying to overcome this, his colleagues and people in politics were saying, Australia is a land of new beginnings and men should be able to live alone the sins of the past and forget them. They were constantly kind of talking about, the Federation, for example, saying we're making a new country. It's a new place. It's a new history. We can forget about that stuff. So there was this very potent idea of a second chance and new career and new place for Meagher. But at the same time, his career does speak so much to the tawdriness of politics. To have someone implicated in so many scandals, who'd done so many wrong things, who, was violent. Violent and nonetheless...
Who whipped a journalist.
Whipping a journalist.
Yes.
John Norton probably deserved it. He was a terrible person himself. Nonetheless, to have people like that in our politics, it does say something about our people and our society. I think our susceptibility to people who pose as victims, who pose as martyrs. I think there's a connection or a resonance with Ned Kelly, for example. And I quote a newspaper talking about how the ruffians of the time kind of posture in the public eye as being these large-hearted beings who were entitled to sympathy. They pose as injured innocence. But there's a special charge to a claim of victimhood in Australia that I think we need to wrestle with a little bit. But we also need to raise the standard of our public figures.
I think also there is much to be said about, allowing our institutions to operate under the rule of law and not be taken captive by mob rule. And that mob rule and, trial by media, they come with massive consequences. And when you allow the wheels of justice to operate as they should, you actually would have got the right result in the Dean case, actually. And it's when politics intervenes and the media intervenes that you get the unjust result.
Yeah, I mean, it's this again can go to some of the framing perhaps, but Meagher always talked about Parliament as being the ultimate court, the ultimate Supreme Court. And so when he was saying, I'm going to go to Parliament to get a bill passed in my name, he was saying, I'm going to the ultimate bar of public opinion as represented in the Parliament. But even then, all the arguments about not interfering with judicial bodies, all those things, they're put forward in Parliament and argued over. But the people there making those arguments themselves are not, grand figures. I mean, one of the people opposing Maher's restoration was a man named Thomas Ley. And some of your listeners may be familiar with Thomas Ley as the Minister for Murder, who had two of his political opponents murdered and then went off to the UK. And I think, again, there murdered another person and eventually got done and died in an asylum. It does say something about the public that we're willing to elect such lawmakers and such people, and that we're willing to allow our emotions to be aroused so easily by people posing as victims or indeed posing as heroes. I think be wary of both.
Indeed. Well, a good note to end on. Patrick Mullins, thank you so much for joining me once again on Afternoon Light.
Thanks so much for having me, Georgina.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.